There were 11 tablets, and Hilde counted them twice before she began handing them out. She did it in the linen room because the linen room had no window. April 1945, a schoolhouse outside Meppen on the River Ems, converted into a reserve hospital 2 winters earlier and never converted back. Outside, the guns had been getting closer for 6 days. That morning, they had stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise, because silence meant the fighting had moved past them and the only thing left to arrive would be the enemy. She pressed 1 tablet into each woman's palm and closed the fingers over it herself. She was 36 years old, head nurse, 14 years in uniform. She had a voice that carried across a ward without ever rising, and she used it now. Not in the mouth, she said, in the pocket. Only if they take you alone into a room. Nobody asked her what she meant by that. They had all sat through the same lectures. The lectures came every few weeks, delivered by a political officer with a clipboard and a rehearsed calm. He would arrive after evening rounds, when the women were too tired to argue, and he would tell them what happened to German nurses who fell into enemy hands. He had numbers. He had place names, mostly in the East, and he described what had been done to nurses at those places in a level tone that made it sound like a supply report. Then he would remind them that the Western enemy was no better, only better dressed. The Canadians in particular, he said, had a reputation. He said they had taken few prisoners at Dieppe. He said their men had been told that German medical staff were fair targets because a nurse patched a soldier and sent him back to shoot at their sons. None of it was true in the way he told it. All of it was believable in a schoolhouse on the Ems in April 1945, when Germany was down to boys and old men, and the radio had stopped bothering to lie about the maps. There were 161 wounded in that building. Most could not stand. 19 were amputees from a shelling outside Sogel, and 4 had been there since the autumn with wounds that would not close because there was nothing left to close them with. There were 3 doctors, all over 60, and 22 women. Hilde had 11 tablets for 22 women, which meant she had spent most of the previous night deciding which of them she considered most likely to be taken into a room alone. One of the 11 went to Käthe Vogel, who was 23 and came from a farm outside Rendsburg, up near the Danish border where the war had mostly been something you read about. Käthe had been conscripted into the medical service in the summer of 1943 and trained for 11 weeks in Hamburg during the worst of the bombing, which she never talked about afterward. She was slow with paperwork and very fast with her hands. She could get a dressing onto a screaming man without hurting him, which is a talent and not a skill, and Hilde had noticed it in her first week. Käthe took the tablet and looked at it in her palm like a coin she had been given in a currency she did not recognize. Another went to Gerda, who was 20 and from Essen, and who had no family left to go home to in any case. Essen had been hit so many times that Gerda had stopped counting after the raid in March of 1943 that took the street her aunt lived on. Her father was somewhere in Russia, officially missing since Kursk, which everyone understood to mean dead. Her mother had gone into a shelter in the Altenissen district in 1944 and had not come out of it. Gerda had joined the medical service because the alternative was a machine shop and 12-hour shifts. And she had learned nursing the way you learn a language by immersion, by standing next to someone who knew and copying her. Gerda did not believe in the party. Her father had believed in it, and her father was a name on a list. But she believed the political officer completely, because she had seen what men did in a bombed city at night, and she had no reason to think the men coming up the road from the west were different animals from the men she already knew. That is the thing about propaganda that people forget when they look back at it. It does not need you to love the government. It only needs you to be afraid, and it only needs to be pointed in the right direction. At around 9 in the morning, a boy on the roof shouted down that there were vehicles on the Meppen road. Hilde went to the front steps and looked, and what she saw did not match anything she had prepared for. There were 4 armored cars and 2 trucks, and one of the trucks was towing a water bowser, and the whole column was moving at the speed of men who did not expect to be shot at. A soldier was sitting on the front of the lead car with his legs hanging over the side, eating something out of a tin. She went back inside and told the women to stand at the ends of their wards and to keep their hands visible. And she went to the stove and began burning paper. Duty rosters, supply requisitions, the ward book with its columns of names and diagnoses, and in the last column, the date each man had died, 60 pages of it going back to October. She fed it in a few sheets at a time so it would not smother the flame. And while she did it, she thought about how strange it was that the last official act of her career would be the destruction of the only proof that any of those men had ever been cared for at all. The Canadian officer came in alone, and he came in with his sidearm holstered and a white pillowcase tied to a broom handle, which he set against the wall by the door like an umbrella. His name was Lieutenant Gordon Nairn. He was 26, from a town in eastern Ontario, and before the war, he had been 8 months into a divinity degree he never finished. His German was clumsy, but confident. He looked at the rows of beds, at the amputees, at the ceiling stains where the roof had been leaking since February. He looked at the women standing rigid at the ends of the wards in aprons that had been boiled so many times they had gone the color of weak tea. Then he took off his cap, which nobody expected, and he said the sentence that all three of them would still be repeating 50 years later. "You are still nurses." He went on. He said that under the convention, medical personnel were not prisoners of war. He said they were protected persons, that they were to be permitted to continue caring for their patients, and that when they were no longer required, they were to be sent back. He said the wounded would be transferred to a British hospital unit within the week, and that until then, the routine of the building would not change. Hilde understood perhaps 2/3 of it. The part she understood most clearly was that he had not raised his voice and had not looked at any of the younger women for longer than a second, and that both of those things were wrong. He was supposed to be a monster. Monsters do not quote paragraph numbers at you. She said nothing at all. She nodded once. In her apron pocket, her thumb was moving back and forth across the tablet like a worry stone, and it kept moving for the rest of that day. At noon, the Canadians brought food into the building, and that was when the first crack appeared. It was not a feast. It was corned beef, hard biscuit, tin peaches, tea with condensed milk, and white bread that had been baked in a field bakery 2 days before. But it came in quantities that made no sense. Käthe stood, holding a mess tin, and could not work out whether the portion was for her or for her whole ward. The German ration in that building had been running at about 1,100 calories a day since February, and the sisters had been quietly shaving their own portions to give to the men who were furthest gone. What the Canadians handed over was somewhere above 2,000. Gerda ate half of hers and put the rest in her apron. She did it without thinking, the way a person does after a certain number of hungry years, and she did it again the next day and the day after that. She was not saving it for the future. She was saving it because she had decided that the food was the fattening before the slaughter, and she wanted to know how long they intended to keep it up. That night, the women lay in the attic room where they slept and talked in whispers with the lamp out. "They will move us tomorrow," Hilde said, "to a collection point. That is where it will start." "Or it will not start," Käthe said. "It will start." "Then why the peaches?" Hilde had no answer. She lay in the dark and tried to build one, and the best she could manage was that it was a technique, that they were being softened so that they would talk freely when the questions came. It held together as long as she did not examine it. Gerda, 3 mattresses away, was working the same problem from the other end and getting nowhere, because if the Canadians intended to kill 22 women, the cheapest way to do it was to do it in the yard on the first morning. And instead, they had spent 4 days' rations and a truck. That is the point where a certain kind of mind starts to come apart. Not when it is contradicted, but when it is contradicted by something generous. They moved on the 4th day, and the move undid more than the food had. There were no cattle wagons. There were 2 3-ton lorries with benches down each side, and the canvas rolled up so that the air could get in, which meant the women could see out. 2 of the guards were women in Canadian Women's Army Corps battle dress, and one of them, a corporal from Manitoba with a broken front tooth, offered around a packet of cigarettes about 10 minutes into the journey. Hilde refused hers. Gerda took one, smoked it, waited to feel something, and felt nothing except the first tobacco she had tasted since December that had not been cut with dried leaves. For 6 hours, they watched the Allied rear area go past, and it dismantled the war in their heads more thoroughly than any argument could have. They saw dumps of jerrycans stacked in blocks the size of houses. They saw ration crates under tarpaulins in a field that went back further than Käthe could see. They saw a workshop where 3 men were welding on a tank engine under a lamp string in daylight with no camouflage netting, because nobody in that field expected an aircraft to come. They saw a queue of soldiers outside a mobile bath unit, and every one of those soldiers was thick through the shoulders in a way that German soldiers had stopped being around 1943. Käthe kept a small notebook and she wrote a single line that afternoon. Asterisk. They are not hiding from the sky. Asterisk. Hilde tried to hold it together with the only tool she had. This is American money, she told the others. It is not their strength. The Americans give it to them. It came out thin, and she heard it come out thin, and so did everyone else in the lorry. They went west through the Netherlands, and in a town whose name none of them caught, Dutch civilians came out to the roadside and shouted at the lorries, and one woman threw a stone that hit the canvas above Gerda's head. The Canadian corporal stood up and waved the crowd back and did not fire and did not shout. Gerda watched her do it and felt something that she could not name for another 20 years, which was the beginning of the understanding that the hatred outside the lorry was not propaganda. It had been earned. Somebody had earned it in her name. They spent 11 days in a transit compound near Nijmegen and then went across to England from Ostend, and it was in England in a camp of huts near Kempton Park with a wire fence and a rugby pitch on the other side of it that the war ended. They heard it through a loudspeaker, on a pole, in English, and then a Polish orderly translated it into German for them, and then he walked away without another word. There was no reaction in the women's compound. Nobody cried. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Hilde sat down on the step of the hut and looked at the ground between her boots and tried to locate the feeling she was supposed to be having. And the honest answer was that she could not find any feeling at all, only a sort of ringing, the way your ears go after a shell lands close and the world arrives back 1 sense at a time. What arrived first, oddly, was the paperwork. 2 days after the surrender, they were processed. A clerk sat at a folding table with a typewriter and a wooden box of blank cards, and each woman gave her name, her date of birth, her hometown, her unit, her father's name, and the date and place of her capture. The clerk typed it, checked it, and slid the card into the box behind the others. Hilde watched her own card disappear between 2 strangers and thought, that is me now. 36 years, 14 of them in this uniform, 400 men buried out of wards I ran, and it fits on a rectangle of cardboard in a drawer in a hut in England. She was wrong about that, and she would learn how wrong 20 years later. The card outlived the war, it outlived the camp, and the clerk, and eventually it outlived her. Because that is what those cards were built to do. Every army in that war ran on paper, and most of it survived. If there is a man in your own family who came back and never talked, or who did not come back at all, that paper is still there. I wrote a guide for the people who find themselves holding a name, an old photograph, and a shoebox of objects nobody ever explained, and who want to reconstruct what an American serviceman actually did between 1941 and 1945. It is called Times Find Your Grandfather's War**, and the link is in the description under this video. Because that is the quiet fact underneath this entire story. Somebody wrote it down. The crossing was on a converted liner out of Liverpool at the end of May. 12 days on a zigzag course that was no longer necessary and that the master steered anyway out of habit. There were nearly 2,000 German prisoners aboard and about 90 women, berthed separately in what had been second-class cabins, 8 to a room, in bunks with mattresses and sprung frames. Käthe lay in hers on the first night and could not sleep because of the softness. She had been sleeping on straw sacks and boards since 1943, and her body had adjusted, and now it had to adjust back, and it did not know how. Hilde spent that crossing waiting for the ocean to be the answer. It was the last hypothesis she had left. 12 days out from any coast, in deep water, with no witnesses. She counted the days, and on the 9th day she stopped counting, and something in her chest let go that she had been holding since the 12th of April. They came into Halifax in the first week of June. Gerda got to the rail and looked, and what she saw made no sense to her at all. Cranes. Whole ones. 100 windows in a row on a hillside, and not one of them boarded, not one taped, not one blown out. Streetlights on standards along the waterfront, and further up the hill, in the dusk, houses with their lights showing, and nothing over the glass. She said, out loud, to nobody, "They have no blackout." Käthe wrote in the notebook that night, June. Halifax. The lamps are lit. Nobody here has ever had to hide. That single detail did more damage to the political officer's lectures than any of the rations or any of the courtesies had. Because you can explain away kindness, you can call it a technique. What you cannot explain away is a whole city that has never once in 6 years been afraid of the sky. The train west took 6 days and covered a distance that none of them could make sense of even while it was happening under them. They crossed Quebec, then Ontario, and Ontario would not end. Käthe pressed her forehead to the glass through hour after hour of spruce and rock and black water, and at some point on the 2nd day she understood, in a way that no map had ever made her understand, exactly what her country had picked a fight with. There were 3 meals a day on that train. Real coffee, which Gerda had not tasted since 1940 and which made her hands shake. Bread, butter, jam, and on the 4th morning, on the tin plate next to Käthe's egg, an orange. She did not eat it. She held it in both hands for most of an hour and turned it over and looked at the pores in the skin. And then she peeled it in one strip, very carefully, and put the strip in her pocket and ate the segments one at a time over the rest of the day. She was 23 years old, and she had last seen a citrus fruit at a Christmas market in 1938 when she was 16. Out the window, on the 5th day, the prairie opened and the wheat went to the horizon in every direction. Gerda looked at it and did a calculation she did not want to do. She thought about the ration cards at home. She thought about the political officer explaining that the Allied blockade was strangling a continent, and about the fields going past this window at 50 miles an hour that nobody was even guarding. Camp 133 sat outside Lethbridge, Alberta, on flat ground under a sky that Käthe said was too large and gave her headaches for the first month. It was one of the biggest prisoner of war camps in North America and held around 12,000 German men. And the women's compound was a small fenced annex on the northeast side, 6 huts, a mess, a wash house with hot water, and a recreation building. The recreation building was where Käthe stopped being able to hold the two worlds together in her head. There was a library in it. Not a shelf, a library. Several hundred volumes in German, some of them shipped in by the YMCA and the Red Cross, and some bought locally. There were newspapers. There was a wind-up gramophone and a box of records. There was a table of woodworking tools with the chisels not counted or chained, and against the far wall, out of tune but working, there was an upright piano. Hilde stood in the doorway and looked at that piano for a long time. She had spent 14 years in an institution that punished women for the state of a locker. She had once seen a 19-year-old orderly given 3 days detention for a burned pan. And here, on the far side of the world, the enemy had put a piano in a room full of prisoners and gone home for the night. The camp commandant was Major Ernest Whitcomb, 44, a grain elevator manager from Moose Jaw in the years when there had been no grain. He came to the women's compound on their 5th morning and stood in front of them with his cap under his arm, and he did not make a speech. He said the Galt Hospital in Lethbridge was in trouble. He said that 140 of Alberta's nurses were overseas or in military hospitals in the East, that the town had been running on retired women and student probationers for 2 years, and that the polio and the accidents and the babies had not stopped coming just because the trained staff had. Then he said it. You are nurses. I am told the convention says you are still nurses. Would any of you be willing to work? There was a silence in that hut that Käthe described afterward as the loudest thing she had ever heard. Whitcomb filled it with the details. in the flat way of a man reading a stock list. The work was voluntary. Nobody would be punished for refusing. 50 cents a day, paid in canteen scrip. Canadian supervision at all times. A truck at 7, a truck back at 7. Hilde could not make her arm move. Her entire understanding of who she was and what these people were had gone into a slow, structural failure over 8 weeks, and this was the load it could not carry. They were not asking her to betray anything. They were asking her to do her job. Käthe raised her hand first, before Whitcomb had finished, which is the only genuinely impulsive thing she did in her whole life. Gerda raised her second, and then asked the question out loud that all of them were thinking. What is it you actually want from us? Whitcomb looked at her. Ma'am, he said, I want the town to have enough nurses. 9 of them went. Hilde was the last to put her name down, and she put it down at 11 o'clock that night, alone, in the orderly room, which she thought was private, and which was not, because Whitcomb wrote about it in his weekly report. The Galt Hospital had somewhere around 150 beds and a red brick front, and a matron named Isabel McRae, who was 38, from Antigonish in Nova Scotia, and who had been running wards through 2 years of shortages with a staff half of what she needed. Matron McRae was not sentimental about any of this. On the first morning, she lined the German women up in the corridor outside her office and told them, through an interpreter and then increasingly without one, that she did not care what any of them had believed in 1939. She cared about her patients. She said that if she caught anyone being unkind to a patient, she would have them back behind the wire by lunchtime. And she said the same rule applied to her Canadian staff regarding the Germans. And everybody understood that the second half of that sentence had been said for a reason. She put Käthe on the children's ward. She put Gerda on surgery. She put Hilde, of all the places in that building, on maternity. Käthe's first patient was a 7-year-old boy from a farm at Coaldale with a badly set arm, and he cried when she came near him, and she sang to him the only thing she could think of, which was a song her mother had sung in Schleswig-Holstein, and he stopped crying because a tune in a foreign language is still a tune. His mother came in at visiting hour and was told who was nursing her son, and stood at the end of the bed for a full minute, and then said, "Well, he likes her." Gerda scrubbed for her first operation 4 days in and did not have to be told twice where to stand. The surgeon was Dr. Hugh Lambert, 41, and the instruments came out of an autoclave that worked, and there was suction that worked, and there was light overhead from a fixture that did not have to be aimed with somebody's hand. Halfway through, he asked for penicillin, and a probationer went and got it, and came back with it, and there was more of it in the cupboard. Gerda had to leave the theater afterward and stand in the sluice with both hands on the sink. In her field hospital, there had been sulfonamide powder and prayer. She had watched men die of infections in beds she had made over a period of days, slowly, while she changed dressings on a wound that everybody in the room already knew had killed him. And here it sat in a brown cupboard next to the gauze, and a 19-year-old with 6 months training could be sent to fetch it without being asked twice. That is not a difference in luck. That is a difference in what a country is able to do, and by the end of that summer, all 3 of them had worked it out. Hilde spent her first 6 weeks on maternity in a state that she later described as sleepwalking. She delivered or assisted at 41 births between July and Christmas. Canadian babies. The children of men who were at that moment in Holland and Germany and on ships coming home, some of whom had killed Germans and some of whom had been killed by them. The first time a woman in labor grabbed her forearm and would not let go, Hilde stood there and let her and thought, very clearly, she does not know. She does not know what I am, and it would not help her right now if she did. The first time a father in the corridor shook her hand, she went into the linen cupboard afterward and stayed there 4 minutes. She started a diary again in August, the first one she had kept since 1941. The entries are short. One of them from the 17th reads, asterisk, a man from Picture Butte thanked me for his daughter. He used my name. He said, Sister Brenner. I did not correct the pronunciation. Asterisk, things kept accumulating. Gerda stepped on a scale in September and had gained 9 kilos since April, and stood on it a second time because she assumed it was broken. Käthe wrote a letter to Rendsburg in July, knowing the censors would read it, and wrote it anyway. Asterisk, Mama, I am in Canada, I am well, I am working in a hospital and I eat 3 times a day. Do not believe what you may hear about my treatment. Asterisk, she had no idea whether the farm was standing. She had no idea whether her mother was alive. The reply came in February, 7 months later, and was 4 lines long, and she carried it in her apron until it fell apart. The Canadian public, meanwhile, was not universally delighted about any of this. There were letters in the Lethbridge paper that autumn about the quantity of meat being served behind the wire while Canadian households were on ration coupons. And the standing joke about the camps in Alberta was that the prisoners ate better than the farmers who guarded them. It was very nearly true, and it was true because the convention said prisoners were to be fed on the scale of the detaining power's own depot troops. And Canada had decided, without much public debate, that it was going to keep to the letter of a treaty with a country that had spent 6 years shredding it. That decision was made in offices by men. The 3 women never met, and it changed the entire remainder of their lives. Not everyone in the women's compound was changed by it. That is worth saying plainly, because the comfortable version of this story is that kindness converts everybody, and it does not. There was a woman in Hut 3 named Ilse Steinke, 47, the widow of a Wehrmacht major killed in Italy. She refused all work, refused the English lessons, kept her hut to barracks discipline, made her bunk to a standard nobody was inspecting, and referred to the women who took the truck each morning as the hospital detail in a tone that took some effort to achieve. She had a photograph she kept between her mattress and the frame, and everyone knew what it was of. By the winter, the compound had sorted itself into 3 uneven groups. There were maybe 15 women like Steinke who took the food and the heat and the library and did not permit any of it to reach them. There were around 40 who simply wanted to survive and go home, and who had stopped thinking about the larger question because the larger question was too expensive. And there were about 20, growing slowly, who had begun to say out loud, first in whispers and then not, that they had been lied to about everything. They sat at different tables. In a mess hall 30 feet wide, they sat at different tables, and they did that for 18 months. Christmas of 1945 was the night it broke open. Matron McRae organized it, and she organized it the way she organized everything, by deciding it would happen and then daring anyone to object. The hospital dining room, decorated with paper chains the children's ward had made and a spruce from the coulee. 2 long tables put end to end, around 40 people, Canadian doctors and nursing staff, the German women who worked there, a handful of ambulatory patients, and 3 orderlies from the camp who had driven in with the truck and been told to sit down and eat. Hilde did not want to go. She told Käthe it was obscene, that there were people in Germany that night with nothing, and that she would not sit at a table with the men who had done it. Käthe said, "They are not treating us like enemies. Why are you the only one still trying to be one?" Hilde went. She promised herself she would eat little and say nothing and be back in the truck by 9. There was turkey. There was a bowl of mashed potato, the size of a basin, and gravy, and something orange and sweet that Gerda later learned was squash, and never learned to like. There was pie. There was a wireless in the corner playing carols out of Calgary, and the room smelled of spruce and coffee and hot fat, and at some point somebody opened a window an inch because it had got too warm, and 30 degrees of frost came in through the gap like a blade. Hilde sat at the end and watched Käthe laughing at something a probationer had said, and felt a flat, ugly anger, and could not have told you at that moment whether it was aimed at Käthe or at herself. After the plates went back, Matron McRae stood up with a glass and waited for the room, which did not take long. She said, "To absent friends," she let that sit. Then she said, "And to the German sisters who have kept my wards running since July, and without whom I would have closed 2 of them. Thank you." 40 people applauded in a hospital dining room in southern Alberta on the 25th of December, 1945, 7 months after the end of a war that had killed 60 million people. And 11 German women sat in the middle of it with their hands in their laps. Then Hugh Lambert came down the length of the table and stopped at Hilde's chair. Everybody in that hospital knew about his brother. Alan Lambert, 23, Essex Scottish, killed on the beach at Dieppe in August 1942 in an operation that put nearly 5,000 Canadians ashore and got fewer than half of them back. He had been dead 3 years and 4 months. There was a photograph of him in Hugh Lambert's office, and there is no version of the events of that beach in which the man who fired the shot was not German. He put out his hand. "Sister Brenner," he said, "I have scrubbed with a lot of theater nurses. You are the best I have worked with. I wanted to say so tonight, in front of people." Hilde looked at the hand. Everything she had been issued as a young woman, every framework she had been given to interpret the world, required that this man hate her. It required it. Hatred was the mechanism. She had been taught that strength meant hardness, that mercy was a defect of the weak, that the enemy was a category and not a set of people, and that the natural response of a man whose brother had been killed by Germans was to want Germans dead. She had believed all of it, and she had believed it in the specific active way that a person believes a thing they have never once had to test. And the man was standing there with his hand out. She got up so fast, the chair went over. She was out through the double doors and down the corridor and out the side entrance into the yard before anyone could reach her, in a hospital apron, in 28 degrees of frost, in the dark. The cold hit her like a wall, and she was grateful for it. She stood in the snow behind the boiler house, with the light from the dining room windows lying in yellow rectangles across the drifts, and she found that she was crying so hard she could not get a breath, and it was not grief, and it was not relief. It was the noise a structure makes when it goes. Everything, the lectures, the tablets, the 11 tablets she had counted out and pressed into the hands of women who trusted her, telling them that this was what awaited them, that this was what these people would do. She had been so certain that she had prepared other human beings to kill themselves for it. Käthe came out after a few minutes with 2 coats over her arm and did not say anything at all. She put a coat around Hilde's shoulders and stood beside her and looked at the same snow. Eventually Hilde said, "It was all lies." "Yes, not some of it, all of it, Käthe." "Yes," Käthe said. "And we are alive to know it, which is more than most." Gerda came out third. She had brought Hilde's shoes, because Hilde had run out in indoor slippers and neither of the others had noticed, and Gerda always noticed. She stood on the other side and put her hands in her pockets, and after a while, she asked the question that none of them had been willing to put into words yet. "What do we do with this at home?" Nobody answered her, because they all already knew. They were going to go back to a country that had lost everything, and stand in front of people who had lost everything, and tell them that the enemy had been decent. There is no year in which that is a welcome sentence, and 1946 was not going to be the one. Behind them, somebody had sat down at the piano in the sunroom, and the carol came out through the wall, thinned to almost nothing, and it was one they knew, because it had been written in Austria in 1818 and had got everywhere since. In February, the Canadians showed them the films. It was done in the men's compound first, and then in the women's, on a projector set up in the recreation building, with a Canadian officer standing at the front who did not editorialize because he did not need to. The footage was British, shot at Belsen the previous April, 10 days after the Canadians had walked into that schoolhouse on the Ems. Some of the men in the main compound shouted that it was faked. That happened in a lot of camps. It happened in that one. In the women's hut, nobody shouted. The film ran for about 20 minutes, and the only sound in the room was the projector. Gerda went back to the hut afterward and sat on her bunk without taking her coat off, and at some point in the night she said, to the ceiling, "My father died for that." Käthe said, "Your father didn't know. He should have known," Gerda said. "I should have known. There was a camp 40 kilometers from Essen, and I knew there was a camp, and I never once asked what it was for." That was the thing that hardened in her and never softened. Hilde's collapse was public and finished in a night. Gerda's went on for the rest of her life, quietly, and it turned into work. She volunteered for extra shifts. She learned English faster than any of them, mostly out of a dictionary at night. She told Käthe in the spring of 1946, "I cannot fix anything back there, so I will be useful here, and that will have to count for something, and she said it in a tone that closed the subject. Hilde spent that year asking questions instead. She asked Isabelle Macrae, one afternoon in the sluice, how the Canadians had managed not to believe their own government. Not exactly in those words, because her English was still coming. But Macrae understood what she was reaching for. Macrae dried her hands and thought about it, because she was not a woman who answered fast. We did believe some of it, she said. We ran some ugly things here in this war, and I will not pretend otherwise. We put our own Japanese families out of their houses on the coast and sold their boats, and I have never been comfortable about it. Then she said, but we could print that in a paper. There were men in Parliament shouting about it while it was happening. Your lot could not shout. That is the whole difference. It is not that we are better people, sister. It is that we were allowed to argue. Hilde wrote that down in the diary that night in German and got it slightly wrong, and the version she carried for the next 56 years was, freedom is not softness. It is the machinery by which a country notices it has made a mistake. Käthe, in the meantime, was building something out of it. She started teaching English in the recreation hut, 3 evenings a week, to anyone who came. Steinke's group did not come at first. By the summer, 4 of them did. And Käthe taught them exactly as she taught everybody else and never once made a remark about it, which Hilde thought was the single most disciplined thing she had ever watched anyone do. Käthe also had letters. A family from Coaldale, whose boy she had nursed in July, had written to the commandant asking whether the German nurse might come out to the farm on a Sunday, and the answer came back that it could be arranged with an escort, and it was, twice. She ate roast chicken at their table and helped their daughter with the jigsaw on the floor, and on the way back in the truck, she cried and could not explain why, and eventually said it was because the kitchen had smelled like her mother's. The repatriation order came in the autumn of 1946. They had known it was coming. Everyone in Canada had been waiting on it, because the camps had been full for a year past the end of the war, and the argument about what to do with 12,000 men in Alberta had been running in the papers all summer. The Lethbridge group was to move east in October. The news from Germany, by then, was not good, and everybody understood roughly what was waiting. The occupation zones were running the civil ration at somewhere between 900 and 1,500 calories a day, depending on where you were and what month it was. The coming winter of 1946 to 1947 turned out to be the coldest in living memory, and it killed people in their homes, and the Germans who lived through it still call it the hunger winter and do not use the word loosely. Hilde said it out loud in the mess one evening. We are being sent from a country with too much food to a country with none, and I have not earned either one. Their last shift at the Galt was on the 9th of October. Macrae gave each of them a parcel, nursing textbooks in English, a bound set of the ward procedure sheets she had written herself, a roll of bandage, and a tin of dressings. And in Hilde's, a note that said she had been the best theater discipline the department had had since 1941, and could quote Macrae as a reference in any country on earth. Hugh Lambert wrote Käthe a letter of recommendation on hospital paper with the seal pressed into it, for a nursing school she had not yet applied to in a country that did not currently have functioning nursing schools. She kept it flat between the covers of a book for 5 years. The cooks gave Gerda a notebook they had all written in, with the recipes she had liked converted into the metric she would need at home. Somebody had drawn a small maple leaf on the front in fountain pen. An old woman named Mrs. Pettigrew came up to the hospital that last week specifically to find Käthe, because Käthe had sat with her grandson through 3 nights of croup in February. She held both of Käthe's hands and said, "You come back here one day. There will be a bed." The train east left on the 15th of October, over the same rails, through the same forests, past the same lit windows. Steinke sat in the same carriage, and she said the thing that Hilde had known was coming for a year and a half. You understand, they were only soft because they won. Had it gone the other way, we would not have been so generous. And Hilde, who 18 months earlier had counted out 11 tablets in a linen room, said, "That is the whole point, Ilse. We lost because we were the kind of country that would not have been generous. They won because they were the kind that was." Steinke did not speak to her again on either continent. The ship out of Halifax was a converted cargo hull with tiers of pipe bunks, and the crossing took 12 days and was hard, and the food was adequate and no more. During it, over the wireless, they got the sentences from Nuremberg. Some of the women wept, some said nothing. Gerda listened to the list of names being read out and thought about the projector clicking in the recreation hut. They came into Bremerhaven at the end of October 1946. Käthe wrote one line in the notebook and then put the notebook away for 11 years. Asterisk. We have come back to the moon. Asterisk. The port was a geometry of broken things. Beyond it, rubble that had been sorted into mountains by women with hand carts, because that work was being done by hand, by hundreds of thousands of women all across the country, and would be for years. The people on the quay side were the color of paper. A British sergeant checked their papers and did not look at their faces. At the reception center, they were interviewed about their captivity, and here the story goes somewhere that the comfortable version never does. Some of the women lied. They said the Canadians had been cruel, that the food had been poor, that they had been worked. They lied because they had worked out, faster than Hilde had, what the currency in Germany was going to be for the next 10 years, and it was suffering. A woman who had suffered had a place. A woman who had spent the hunger years eating turkey in Alberta did not. Hilde told the truth. She said the treatment had been correct, that the rations had been full, that she had worked voluntarily in a civilian hospital and been paid, and that she had been treated by the enemy better than she had been treated by her own service. The interviewer wrote something at the top of her sheet. She saw it upside down. It was a short word she could not read, and it followed her paperwork for 4 years and cost her 2 jobs. They took the medical supplies at the search table. Foreign materials, the man said, the dressings, the tinned gauze, the sulfa, all of it went into a crate in a country that in October of 1946 did not have enough dressings to go around. Then they were given travel permits and put on separate trains. Hilde reached Hamburg on the 2nd of November. Her mother was living in the cellar of a house on a street that was otherwise gone, in one room with a stove made from a fuel drum. She looked at her daughter in the doorway, at the coat, at the weight on her, and the first thing she said, before hello, was, "Where were you?" Hilde tried. She said the words correct, and convention, and hospital, and she watched her mother's face close on the second sentence. Her brother Ernst had died at Kurland in 1944. Her mother did not say the word traitor that night, but she said it the following spring. And after that, Hilde lived elsewhere in the city and came on Sundays for 11 years. Käthe got to Rendsburg on the 5th. The farm was standing. Her mother came out of the byre and dropped a bucket. Her father shook her hand, which was what he did, and then held on to it a moment too long, and never once in the next 30 years asked her a single question about where she had been or what she had seen, because he had his own 1943, and it was not going to be discussed either. Käthe kept Canada mostly to herself. She used what she had learned and did not say where she had learned it. Gerda reached Essen on the 11th and walked to where her street had been and could not find the corner, because there was no corner, only a graded slope of brick with a path worn over it. She stood there for about an hour. Then she walked to the hospital, which was operating out of 2 floors of a building whose upper stories were open to the sky, and asked for work and was hired in under 4 minutes because they would have hired anyone with hands. She worked that winter in wards where the water froze in the jugs. She had come from a place with unlimited penicillin to a place with no coal, and she did the arithmetic on it every single day for 2 years, and it never once came out in a way she could live with easily. What happened to them afterward took decades to resolve, and it resolved differently for each. Hilde stayed in Hamburg and worked in the refugee hospitals, which is where the hardest nursing in Europe was done between 1946 and 1950, on populations of displaced people arriving from the East at a rate nobody had planned for. She ran a ward the Canadian way, which mostly meant that she wrote everything down and refused to be shouted at. In 1949, a letter reached her from Isabelle Macrae, forwarded 3 times, offering to sponsor her. She thought about it for 14 months. In 1951, at 42, she landed in Saskatchewan. and she spent the next 26 years nursing in Regina. And she and McCry remained close, until McCry died in 1979. She never married. When people asked her why she had emigrated, she gave a practical answer about opportunity, and it was not the answer. Käthe got into a nursing school in Kiel in 1950 on the strength of a letter written in Alberta by a surgeon whose brother had been killed by Germans. She qualified in 1953, married a schoolteacher, had 2 sons, and by 1964 was the senior tutor at a teaching hospital in Hamburg, where she trained something over 1,000 nurses. Her students all remember one thing she said, which was that a patient is a patient before he is anything else, and none of them knew where she had learned it. In 1976, she went back to Lethbridge with her husband and her older boy. Macrae was 70 and Lambert was 72, and both of them came. Gerda's was the longest road. She left Essen in 1951 for a job at an American military hospital at Landstuhl, where a surgeon noticed within a fortnight that she scrubbed like somebody trained in a system with resources, and asked her about it, and got a short answer. She married an American technical sergeant from Duluth in 1955, and moved to Minnesota, and she nursed in Minneapolis until 1987. She told her husband a version. She told her daughter nothing at all until 1991, when the daughter found the recipe notebook with the maple leaf on the front while clearing a closet, and asked and got the whole thing over 2 days at a kitchen table. In 1976, the town of Lethbridge invited its former prisoners back, and around 90 came from 4 countries, and the local paper ran the photographs for a week. There is a plaque on a wall in that city that mentions the German nursing sisters who worked in the town hospital in 1945 and 1946. Käthe stood in front of it with Macrae, who was leaning on a stick by then, and neither of them said very much. In the 1980s, a historian from Edmonton went around with a tape recorder collecting what was left. Hilde gave him the diary, all of it, including the entry about the tablets. Gerda sat for 4 hours of tape in a house in Minneapolis, and at the end of it, he asked her what the most important moment had been. And she did not say Christmas, and she did not say the orange on the train. She said the film. In February, because everything before that was about what they did to us, and that was about what we did. Hilde died in Regina in 2004 at 95. Käthe died at Rendsburg in 2017 at 95 as well. Gerda died in Minnesota in 2009 at 84. Before she went, Hilde recorded one more piece of tape, and it is the closest thing this story has to a verdict. She said that they had been sent across an ocean expecting to be destroyed, and had instead been handed a mess tin and asked whether they would mind taking a maternity shift. She said that no army had ever beaten an idea out of her. What had beaten it was a lieutenant with a broom handle and a pillowcase, quoting a paragraph number at a woman who had 11 tablets in her apron pocket and then keeping to it. She said, "They did not persuade me. They simply behaved, day after day, in a manner that my beliefs did not permit. And in the end, it was my beliefs that had to go, because the evidence would not." Of the 22 women taken in that schoolhouse on the Ems in April 1945, 17 lived past 80. 9 of them ended their lives in North America. Not one of them, in any interview, any deposition, any letter, or any tape, ever reported being mistreated in Canadian hands. The plaque in Lethbridge does not say anything clever. It carries the sentence that Lieutenant Gordon Nairn said in a doorway with his cap in his hand, because it was the sentence that started all of it, and because none of the women who heard it ever got it out of their heads. You are still nurses. And the question it leaves sitting in the room 80 years later is not really about 1945. It is about what happens the next time somebody in a uniform stands in front of a tired room with a clipboard and explains in a reasonable voice exactly what kind of animals the people on the other side of the line are. Because the women in that schoolhouse were not stupid, and they were not monsters. They were frightened, and they were told, and they believed it, and it very nearly cost them their lives at their own hands. What broke it was not an argument. It was a stranger who behaved decently when he had every excuse not to, and who kept doing it long after it stopped being convenient. That is the whole of it. That is the entire mechanism.